My uncle's $10 million company went to whoever could crack his final code in 48 hours, and my Harvard-educated siblings hired hackers while I remembered the bedtime stories he told me. Uncle Elijah died on a Monday morning at 4:17 a.m. in his penthouse overlooking the Seattle skyline, his fingers still resting on his laptop keyboard. The medical examiner said massive heart attack, instant and painless, though I doubted anything about death was truly painless. He was 53 years old and worth approximately $47 million, most of it tied up in Datacrypt Solutions, the cybersecurity company he'd built from nothing over 20 years. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday, but the will reading happened Wednesday afternoon at his attorney's office downtown, which should have been my first clue that something unusual was coming. My 3 siblings arrived in designer suits and practiced grief expressions, already calculating their inheritance shares before the lawyer even opened the envelope. My older sister Octavia flew in from Boston where she worked as a senior partner at a venture capital firm, her Harvard MBA framed in her corner office alongside photos with senators and tech billionaires. She'd made her first million by 30 and her fifth by 35, building an empire through ruthless investment strategies and zero emotional attachment to failure. My brother Sterling arrived from San Francisco in a Tesla that cost more than most people's houses, his Stanford computer science degree having led him to found 3 successful startups before age 40. My younger sister Magnolia came from Manhattan, where she ran a hedge fund specializing in tech acquisitions, her Yale economics background and photographic memory making her a legend in financial circles. Then there was me, Phoenix Castellano, the family disappointment with a degree in literature from a state school and a job teaching creative writing at a community college. I made $43,000 a year and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with secondhand furniture. The attorney's name was Bernard Yates, and he had the exhausted expression of someone who'd spent decades managing wealthy people's demands and deceptions. He opened the leather portfolio containing Uncle Elijah's will and began reading in a monotone voice that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. The usual legal language about sound mind and disposing of assets. Then he reached the part that made my siblings lean forward with predatory interest. To my nieces and nephews, I leave the controlling shares of Datacrypt Solutions, valued at approximately $10.3 million as of this date. However, this inheritance comes with conditions. Bernard paused and looked at each of us over his reading glasses, as if measuring whether we were prepared for what came next. Uncle Elijah created a challenge that must be completed within 48 hours of this reading. Whoever solves it receives the company. The others receive nothing. The room exploded with simultaneous objections. Octavia demanded to know the legal basis for such a ridiculous condition. Sterling called it manipulative garbage and threatened to contest the will immediately. Magnolia pulled out her phone and started texting her attorneys before Bernard could continue. I just sat there feeling the familiar weight of being invisible in my own family, the one who didn't matter because I didn't have the right credentials or income bracket. Bernard raised his hand for silence and continued reading. The challenge is this. I have encrypted a file containing the transfer documents and access codes for Datacrypt Solutions. The encryption is unbreakable by conventional means. The password is a single phrase, no numbers or special characters, exactly 17 words long. You have 48 hours from the moment I give you the encrypted file to crack it. Whoever submits the correct password first inherits everything. Sterling laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. That's it? A password challenge? Uncle Elijah built his fortune on encryption. This is literally what our family does. He looked at Octavia and Magnolia with confidence that bordered on arrogance. I can have my team crack this in 6 hours maximum. Octavia was already on her phone. I know 3 cybersecurity firms that specialize in this exact type of work. Money is no object. Magnolia nodded in agreement, her fingers flying across her tablet screen. I'm allocating $500,000 for this. We can hire the best hackers in the world, run distributed computing attacks, brute force if necessary. Bernard cleared his throat. There's more. Uncle Elijah specified that you must work individually. No teams, no hired help. Just your own knowledge and skills. Any evidence of outside assistance results in immediate disqualification. The objections started again, louder this time. Octavia stood up, her voice taking on the commanding tone she used to intimidate competitors in boardrooms. This is absurd. We're business people, not hackers. How are we supposed to crack military-grade encryption alone? Sterling was pacing, his tech genius brain already working through possibilities. What's the encryption method? AES 256? RSA? Some proprietary algorithm he designed? Bernard consulted his notes. The file itself will tell you the encryption type. That's all the information he provided. He handed each of us a USB drive in a sealed envelope. The 48-hour countdown begins the moment you open the envelope. Choose your timing wisely. Magnolia grabbed hers immediately. I'm starting now. Every second counts. Sterling and Octavia took theirs with similar urgency. I held mine carefully, the small drive feeling impossibly heavy with the weight of Uncle Elijah's final test. We left the attorney's office and gathered in the building's parking garage, an impromptu war council that I wasn't technically invited to, but attended anyway through sheer proximity. Sterling was already planning his strategy aloud. I'll set up a virtual machine isolated from everything, run every decryption tool I have access to, analyze the algorithm for weaknesses. Octavia interrupted. I'm calling everyone I know in cybersecurity for advice, not help, just consultation about methodology. That should be allowed under the rules. Magnolia was downloading software to her laptop right there in the parking garage. I'm going to systematically try password combinations based on everything I know about Uncle Elijah's life. Birthdays, anniversaries, favorite quotes, places he lived. It has to be something personally meaningful. They all turned to look at me then, as if suddenly remembering I existed, and wondering what possible strategy I could employ with my useless literature degree and complete lack of technical expertise. "What are you going to do, Phoenix?" Sterling asked with barely concealed condescension. "Write a poem about encryption?" Octavia didn't even pretend to be polite. "You should probably just forfeit now. Save yourself the embarrassment of failing publicly." Magnolia at least tried for sisterly concern. "This is way outside your skill set. Maybe Uncle Elijah didn't realize how difficult he was making this for you." I looked at the USB drive in my hand and thought about Uncle Elijah, about the hundreds of hours we'd spent together when I was young, about the stories he'd told me that my siblings had been too busy to listen to. "I'm going to remember," I said quietly. "Remember what?" Sterling laughed. "Remember how to hack? You can barely use Excel." I shook my head. "Remember the stories." My siblings exchanged glances that clearly communicated their opinion that I'd already lost my mind. They left in their expensive cars to begin their sophisticated technological assaults on Uncle Elijah's encryption, leaving me standing alone in the parking garage holding a USB drive and a memory. I drove to my apartment in my 12-year-old sedan, the check engine light glowing cheerfully as it had for 6 months, and sat at my kitchen table with my old laptop. The envelope containing the USB drive sat unopened in front of me while I made tea and tried to quiet my racing thoughts. Uncle Elijah had been my favorite person in the world when I was young, before my siblings had discovered ambition and success, and I'd discovered that being smart in ways that didn't produce wealth made you invisible. He used to watch me on Saturday afternoons when my parents were working, and instead of putting on movies or giving me video games, he'd tell me stories, elaborate wandering tales about dragons and knights and magic kingdoms that always had strange twists and unexpected morals. My siblings had found his stories boring and childish, but I'd been captivated, begging for one more chapter, one more adventure. I opened the envelope at exactly 6 p.m., starting my 48-hour countdown. The USB drive contained a single encrypted file labeled inheritance.exe and a text document with instructions. The text explained that the file used military-grade encryption that would take approximately 2.7 billion years to crack using brute force methods with current technology. The password was exactly 17 words, no numbers, no punctuation, all lowercase, spaces between each word. One attempt was allowed every 5 minutes to prevent automated guessing. After 100 incorrect attempts, the file would permanently delete itself. I did the math quickly. 100 attempts over 5-minute intervals meant I could theoretically try for just over 8 hours before failure became permanent. My siblings, with their technological prowess and consulting experts, would burn through attempts quickly. I needed to be more careful. The first 6 hours, I didn't try a single password. Instead, I pulled out old photo albums my mother had given me, boxes of childhood memories I'd kept but rarely examined, pictures of Uncle Elijah and me at the zoo, at museums, sitting in his apartment while he gestured wildly, telling stories I could almost hear through the frozen images. I found my old journals from age 7 through 15, pages filled with summaries of his stories that I'd written down because I didn't want to forget them. The dragon who learned to sing, the knight who was afraid of horses, the princess who saved herself. Stories that had seemed simple as a child but had contained layers of meaning I was only beginning to understand as an adult. Each story had taught something about courage, creativity, thinking differently than everyone else expected. Uncle Elijah had been teaching me his philosophy through fiction, training me to see problems from unexpected angles. My phone buzzed with texts from my siblings throughout the evening. Sterling sent a message at 8 p.m. saying he'd already tried 30 different password combinations based on Uncle Elijah's biographical information, all failures. Octavia texted at 9:30 p.m. that her consultation with cybersecurity experts suggested the encryption might have a backdoor vulnerability she could exploit without technically breaking the no assistance rule. Magnolia called at 11 p.m. sounding frustrated and exhausted. I've tried every significant phrase from Uncle Elijah's life I can think of. Birthplaces, favorite books, company slogans. Nothing works. How many attempts have you used? I asked. 38 so far. I'm being careful, but I'm running out of obvious options. I admitted I hadn't tried any yet, that I was still researching. She laughed in disbelief. You haven't even started? Phoenix, you're going to run out of time. After she hung up, I went back to my journals and read them cover to cover, searching for patterns. Around 2 a.m., I found something interesting. In my journal from age 9, I'd written about a story Uncle Elijah had told me about a wizard who hid his most important spell in plain sight. Everyone searched for complex incantations and ancient languages, but the spell was actually hidden in a children's nursery rhyme that everyone knew but nobody thought to try. The story had been about how people overlook simple solutions when they're expecting complexity, how intelligence sometimes means recognizing that the obvious answer is correct. I flipped through more journals finding similar themes. The treasure that was hidden in the first place everyone looked. the monster that was defeated by speaking its name plainly instead of using powerful magic. Uncle Elijah had been obsessed with the idea that people overcomplicated things, that brilliance sometimes meant seeing the simple truth everyone else missed. I texted Sterling at 3 a.m. asking if he remembered any of Uncle Elijah's bedtime stories from when we were kids. His response came back immediately, suggesting he was still awake working on the encryption. What stories? He never told me stories. He was always working or reading technical manuals. I felt a strange sadness reading that, realizing my siblings had been so focused on achievement even as children that they'd missed the parts of Uncle Elijah that mattered most. He told me stories every Saturday for 8 years, I replied, about dragons and wizards and knights. Sterling's response was dismissive. That was kid stuff for you because you were the baby. The rest of us were learning actual skills. I didn't bother correcting him that I'd been 8 when the stories started, not a baby, or that learning to think creatively was an actual skill. I just went back to my journals and kept reading. By sunrise on Thursday, I'd covered my kitchen table with journal pages, photos, and notes I'd made mapping out every story I could remember. The common thread was increasingly obvious. Uncle Elijah's stories always featured protagonists who succeeded by doing the unexpected, by ignoring conventional wisdom, by trusting their instincts over expert advice. The dragon who learned to sing had defeated an army not through fire and violence but through beauty that made warriors remember why they'd wanted to live peacefully. The knight who was afraid of horses had saved the kingdom by fighting on foot in ways no one expected. The princess who saved herself had rejected the rescue narrative entirely and negotiated a treaty with the dragon instead. Every story was about subverting expectations, about finding power in being different from what everyone else valued. Uncle Elijah had been telling me that my differences weren't weaknesses. They were exactly what made me capable of seeing things my siblings couldn't. My phone rang at 8 a.m. Octavia calling from Boston, where she'd apparently stayed up all night working on the encryption. I'm at 73 attempts and nothing's working. I've tried every significant phrase from his life, every quote from his published papers, every company slogan and mission statement. How many have you used? 5, I lied, not wanting to admit I'd been focusing on childhood memories instead of sophisticated hacking techniques. She was quiet for a moment. What approach are you taking? I'm thinking about what he valued, I said carefully. Not what he said publicly, but what he actually believed in. Octavia laughed bitterly. That's poetic but useless. This is an encryption challenge, not a personality test. After she hung up, I looked at my notes and realized I needed to be more systematic. 17 words meant the password was a complete sentence or phrase, something meaningful enough to be worth protecting a $10 million inheritance. I started listing every significant phrase from Uncle Elijah's stories that I could remember. Some were too short, some too long, but I was looking for ones that captured his essential philosophy. Around 10 a.m., I found it in my journal from age 11. Uncle Elijah had told me a story about a treasure hunter who spent his whole life searching for gold in distant lands, ignoring the diamond mine on his own property because it seemed too easy, too close to home. The moral had been explicit, unlike most of his stories. Sometimes the most valuable things are right in front of us, but we miss them because we're looking for complexity instead of truth. I counted the words. Exactly 17. My hand started shaking as I typed it into the password field. All lowercase. Spaces between words. Exactly as the instructions specified. The 5-minute timer counted down while I held my breath. At 0, I pressed enter. The screen flickered. Access denied. My heart sank. I'd been so certain the phrase had felt so right, but apparently I'd been wrong. I had 99 attempts remaining and 40 hours left. I went back to my journals and kept searching. Maybe the phrase was from a different story. Maybe I'd misremembered the exact wording. Around noon, Magnolia called, sounding panicked. I'm at 86 attempts and I think I'm close. I've been trying variations of his favorite philosophical quotes, but nothing's working. The pressure is getting to me. I'm starting to make stupid mistakes. I tried to sound encouraging. You're being too rigid. Maybe the password isn't something famous or public. Maybe it's something personal. Something only someone who really knew him would remember. Magnolia was quiet. I didn't really know him, Phoenix. None of us did. We were always too busy being successful. After she hung up, I stared at my journals and had a realization that made me feel stupid for not seeing it sooner. The password wasn't from one of Uncle Elijah's stories. It was one of his stories, condensed into 17 words. I grabbed my journal from age 10 and found the story I'd summarized as The Boy Who Collected Stars. In my childish handwriting, I'd written the entire plot. A boy wanted to be special, so he collected stars from the sky and put them in jars, but the stars died without space to shine. He learned that trying to own beautiful things destroys them. You have to let them be free to appreciate their light. I counted the words in that summary. 23, too long. But underneath, I'd written what Uncle Elijah had said when he finished the story. His actual moral in his exact words that I'd copied down because they'd seemed important. I counted. 17 words exactly. I typed carefully, triple-checking each word against my journal entry. The most valuable things in life cannot be possessed, only appreciated by letting them remain free and wild. I hit enter and waited through the 5-minute countdown, my heart racing so fast I felt lightheaded. The timer hit 0. The screen flickered again. This time, the encrypted file began to decrypt, a progress bar appearing and filling slowly. It took 3 minutes of processing before a PDF document opened, revealing the transfer documents for DataCrypt solutions, access codes for bank accounts, legal paperwork transferring ownership. At the top of the first page was a video file icon. I clicked it, and Uncle Elijah's face appeared on my screen, recorded sometime in the weeks before his death. He looked tired but peaceful, sitting in his office with Seattle visible through the windows behind him. Phoenix, if you're watching this, you figured out my puzzle. I'm not surprised. You were always the smart one in the family, though nobody else recognized it because you were smart in ways that don't show up on resumes or bank statements. Your siblings are brilliant at what they do. I'm proud of their success, but they learned to value the wrong things. They learned that money and status and credentials matter more than wisdom, creativity, compassion. You were different. You listened to my stories when they thought stories were childish. You asked questions about meaning instead of just memorizing facts for tests. You chose a career helping others discover their voices instead of climbing corporate ladders. That's why you're the only one who could solve this puzzle. The password wasn't hidden in technical manuals or company documents. It was hidden in the time we spent together, in the lessons I tried to teach through fiction, in the relationship we built while everyone else was too busy achieving things. Uncle Elijah paused in the video, and I saw emotion flash across his face. The company is yours because you're the only one who understands what it's really for. DataCrypt Solutions isn't about making money from encryption technology. It's about protecting freedom, privacy, and dignity in a world that's increasingly trying to control and commodify everything. I built encryption systems that let dissidents communicate safely, that protect journalists from authoritarian governments, that give ordinary people sovereignty over their own data and lives. Your siblings would turn it into a profit machine, selling to the highest bidder regardless of ethics. You'll use it the way I intended, as a tool for liberation, not oppression. The video ended with Uncle Elijah looking directly into the camera. I love you, Phoenix. I always saw your potential even when you doubted yourself. Now prove me right. Build something meaningful with this gift. I sat staring at my laptop screen in stunned silence, tears running down my face, my phone buzzing with increasingly frantic calls from my siblings that I ignored. The weight of what had just happened was overwhelming. I'd inherited a $10 million company, financial security beyond anything I'd imagined, and the responsibility of carrying forward Uncle Elijah's vision. The countdown timer on my screen showed I'd had 43 hours and 27 minutes remaining. I'd solved it with one attempt, while my siblings had burned through dozens of guesses, each trying to brute force a puzzle that required remembering, rather than computing. I needed to tell them, needed to be present for the fallout. But first I let myself sit in the quiet apartment and cry for the uncle who'd seen value in me when everyone else hadn't, who'd left me, not just wealth, but validation. I called Bernard Yates at 1 p.m. and told him I'd successfully decrypted the file. His professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing surprise. Already? It's been less than 20 hours. Most people were expecting this to take the full 48. I explained that I'd approached it differently than my siblings probably had. Bernard asked me to forward the decrypted files to verify their authenticity, which I did, and he confirmed within 30 minutes that I'd legitimately cracked the encryption. Congratulations, Ms. Castellano. I'll begin the process of transferring ownership immediately. There are significant legal documents to sign, board meetings to attend, and your uncle left detailed instructions about the transition. Can you come to my office this afternoon? I agreed and hung up, then finally answered the 10th call from Sterling, who was apparently having a complete meltdown. What approach are you using? Sterling demanded without preamble. I've tried 93 different passwords and nothing's working. I'm running out of time and attempts. I need to know what strategy you're employing because clearly you know something we don't. I took a deep breath. I already cracked it, Sterling. 3 hours ago. The silence on the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Then his voice came back, low and dangerous. What do you mean you cracked it? That's impossible. You don't have the technical skills to crack military-grade encryption. I didn't crack the encryption through technical skills, I explained. I remembered what Uncle Elijah valued and what he tried to teach us. The password was from one of his bedtime stories. Sterling's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. You're lying. You're trying to psyche me out, make me waste my remaining attempts on nonsense. I'm not lying, and I'm not trying to psyche you out. I'm telling you I already won. Sterling hung up on me. 30 seconds later, Octavia called. Sterling says you're claiming to have solved the encryption. If this is some kind of mind game, it's beneath even you. I repeated what I'd told Sterling, adding that Bernard Yates had verified the solution and was already processing the ownership transfer. Octavia's breathing got heavier. Let me understand this correctly. You, Phoenix Castellano, with your community college teaching job and your complete lack of technical expertise, somehow beat me, Sterling, and Magnolia at a cybersecurity challenge by remembering bedtime stories. The contempt in her voice was thick enough to choke on. I didn't beat you at cybersecurity. I beat you at paying attention to Uncle Elijah when we were kids. There's a difference. Octavia's voice dropped to something cold and sharp. We're contesting this. There's no way you solved this legitimately. You had help or you somehow cheated. We'll sue and drag this out for years if necessary. After Octavia hung up, I called Magnolia, who answered on the first ring. Tell me this is some kind of mistake. Tell me Sterling and Octavia are overreacting and you didn't actually crack the encryption yet. I'm sorry, Magnolia. I did crack it. The password was 17 words from something Uncle Elijah told me when I was 10 years old. Magnolia was crying. You had an unfair advantage. He spent more time with you, told you things he didn't tell us. That's not fair as a basis for inheritance. I felt a flash of anger that surprised me with its intensity. I didn't have an unfair advantage. I had a relationship with him that you three were too busy to develop. He invited all of us to spend time with him. You chose your careers and achievements. I chose him. That's not unfair. That's priorities. Magnolia's voice hardened through her tears. We're not letting this stand. Get ready for a legal battle. The next 3 days were a blur of attorney meetings, paperwork, and increasingly hostile communications from my siblings. They hired a law firm that specialized in contested inheritances and filed an emergency injunction attempting to freeze all assets until the matter could be litigated. Bernard Yates explained that such challenges were common but rarely successful when the will was clearly written and the challenge had been completed legitimately. Your uncle anticipated this exact scenario. He included provisions that specifically address attempts to contest based on claims of unfairness or lack of equal opportunity. The video will provide clear evidence that he intended the challenge to reward the relationship you built with him, not technical skills. Still, we should prepare for a lengthy legal process. My siblings have substantial resources and they're highly motivated. The temporary injunction hearing happened the following Monday in a courtroom that smelled like furniture polish and quiet desperation. My siblings arrived with 3 attorneys who looked like they billed $800 per hour, dressed in suits that cost more than my monthly rent. I sat with Bernard Yates in my best professional outfit from Target, trying not to feel intimidated by the obvious wealth disparity. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judith Blackwood, reviewed the case materials with an expression that gave nothing away. She asked the opposing counsel to present their argument for why the inheritance should be frozen and the challenge invalidated. The lead attorney, a man named Gregory Frost, stood and delivered a polished speech about unfair advantage and unequal opportunity, arguing that Uncle Elijah had essentially rigged the challenge to favor one grandchild over the others. Mr. Castellano deliberately designed a challenge that required information only Ms. Phoenix Castellano possessed, Gregory argued, his voice pitched for maximum sympathetic impact. He told her stories and shared personal philosophies that he withheld from his other nieces and nephews, creating an information asymmetry that made it impossible for them to compete on equal footing. This constitutes unequal treatment and potentially undue influence over the deceased during his final years. Judge Blackwood interrupted. Are you arguing that an uncle spending time with one niece and sharing stories with her constitutes undue influence? Gregory hesitated. We're arguing that he deliberately created conditions where only she could succeed, which suggests the competition was a sham designed to circumvent normal inheritance distribution. Bernard stood to respond. Your Honor, may I present evidence that contradicts this characterization? The judge nodded and Bernard pulled out a thick folder. These are phone records, emails, and text messages spanning 20 years, Bernard explained, handing copies to the judge and opposing counsel. They document repeated invitations from Elijah Castellano to all 4 of his nieces and nephews to spend time with him, attend events together, visit his home, and engage in various activities. The other 3 consistently declined due to their busy schedules and professional obligations. Ms. Phoenix Castellano consistently accepted these invitations and maintained regular contact with her uncle throughout her life. He didn't withhold information from the others. They chose not to be present to receive it. Gregory flipped through the evidence, looking increasingly uncomfortable. The volume of documentation was overwhelming. Emails from Uncle Elijah inviting Sterling to coffee, declined. Texts asking Octavia to visit, ignored. Voicemails requesting Magnolia attend a family dinner, unreturned. Years of attempts to maintain relationships that my siblings had been too busy to prioritize. Judge Blackwood reviewed the materials in silence for several minutes. Mr. Frost, she finally said, are you arguing that people have a legal obligation to spend time with their relatives in order to preserve future inheritance rights? Because that's not a principle I'm familiar with in estate law. Gregory straightened his shoulders. We're arguing that the challenge was designed to be unsolvable, except by someone with specific private knowledge, making it effectively predetermined rather than a genuine competition. Bernard produced another document. The challenge was solvable by anyone who knew Elijah Castellano's values and philosophy, which were publicly available through his published writings, speeches, and interviews. However, the password specifically came from oral stories he told, which he offered to share with all his nieces and nephews, but only one took him up on the offer. Judge Blackwood's expression suggested her patience was wearing thin. Motion denied. The will clearly states the terms of the challenge. Ms. Castellano completed the challenge within the specified time frame using legitimate means. The fact that she was better prepared due to her relationship with the deceased is not grounds for invalidating the inheritance. Case dismissed. My siblings appealed immediately, dragging the legal process out for another 2 months, while I remained in a strange limbo of being technically the owner of DataCrypt Solutions, but unable to access any assets or make any decisions. Bernard warned me that the appeals process could take 6 months or longer, that my siblings had the resources to fight this for years if they chose. During this period, I continued teaching my classes at the community college, living in my same small apartment, driving my same aging car. The only difference was the constant stream of legal documents I had to review and sign, depositions I had to attend, questions I had to answer about my relationship with Uncle Elijah, and how I'd solved his encryption challenge. My siblings' attorneys tried every angle they could think of, arguing that the challenge had been too difficult, that it violated public policy, that it demonstrated Uncle Elijah had lacked capacity when he created it. The appeals court hearing happened on a Wednesday morning in early December, 3 months after Uncle Elijah's death. The courtroom was grander than the first one, with dark wood paneling and a sense of historical weight. The 3-judge panel included 2 men and 1 woman, all looking like they'd been hearing legal arguments since before I was born. Gregory Frost presented an expanded version of his previous arguments, adding expert testimony about encryption difficulty and the statistical improbability of solving such a challenge without extensive technical training. One of his experts, a cybersecurity professor from MIT, testified that the encryption Uncle Elijah had used would normally require years of specialized knowledge to crack, making it fundamentally unfair to expect non-experts to solve it. Bernard cross-examined him carefully. Would it be accurate to say that knowing the password makes the encryption trivially easy to crack, regardless of technical expertise? The professor admitted that was true. Bernard then played Uncle Elijah's video for the court, the one that had been attached to the decrypted files. The judges watched in silence as Uncle Elijah explained his reasoning, his voice filling the courtroom. Phoenix listened to my stories when they thought stories were childish. She asked questions about meaning instead of just memorizing facts for tests. She chose a career helping others discover their voices instead of climbing corporate ladders. That's why she's the only one who could solve this puzzle. When the video ended, one of the judges, an older man named Justice Raymond Whitfield, asked Gregory directly, "Counselor, are you arguing that a person cannot leave their assets to the family member who maintained the closest relationship with them?" Gregory tried a different approach. "We're arguing that framing it as a competition created false hope in the other beneficiaries and wasted their time on a challenge they couldn't possibly win." Justice Whitfield looked skeptical. They couldn't win because they didn't have the information. They didn't have the information because they chose not to spend time with the deceased over a period of decades. How is that the deceased's fault or the responsibility of the one beneficiary who did maintain a relationship? Gregory had no good answer. The appeals court upheld the original ruling unanimously, with a written opinion that Bernard later told me was unusually pointed in its criticism of my siblings' position. The court basically said they were trying to weaponize their own neglect of their uncle as grounds for inheritance, which was not a valid legal strategy. The opinion specifically noted that Elijah Castellano had made extensive documented efforts to maintain relationships with all his nieces and nephews, that 3 of them had consistently rebuffed these efforts while 1 had embraced them, and that creating an inheritance challenge based on that relationship was entirely within his rights. The inheritance was mine, legally and finally. The actual transfer of ownership happened on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room at Datacrypt Solutions headquarters in downtown Seattle. Bernard walked me through stacks of documents explaining what each one meant and where to sign. The company's board of directors had been notified and were waiting in an adjacent conference room to meet their new owner. I felt like an imposter in my Target suit surrounded by corporate furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary. Bernard must have sensed my anxiety because he paused before we entered the boardroom. "Your uncle chose you for a reason, Miss Castellano. He believed you understood the company's mission better than your siblings would have. Trust that judgment." The board consisted of 8 people, 5 men and 3 women, all looking at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism about whether a community college teacher could run a multi-million-dollar tech company. I introduced myself and explained that I intended to maintain Uncle Elijah's vision for the company, rather than dramatically changing direction. The board members asked careful questions about my background, my understanding of the business, my plans for leadership. I was honest about my limitations. I'm not a cybersecurity expert, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I need to rely on the existing team's technical expertise. But I understand what my uncle built this company to do: protect privacy and freedom for people who need it most. That mission doesn't change. One board member, a woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who served as chief technology officer, asked the question I'd been dreading. "What makes you qualified to lead a company in an industry you have no experience in?" I took a breath and decided honesty was my only real option. My uncle thought I was qualified because I listened when he talked about values and purpose instead of just profit margins. If that's not enough for you, I understand. But I'm not selling, and I'm not stepping aside. The board meeting ended with polite but non-committal expressions of support. Dr. Tanaka stayed after the others left, approaching me with a directness I appreciated. "Your uncle talked about you sometimes," she said. "He was proud of you for choosing teaching over more lucrative careers. He said you had integrity that was rare in families with money. I'm willing to give you a chance to prove him right, but you need to understand that this company has competitors who will view your inexperience as weakness. You'll need to learn fast." I thanked her and asked if she'd be willing to help educate me about the technical aspects of the business. She agreed, and we scheduled daily meetings for the next month to bring me up to speed on everything from encryption protocols to market positioning. It was overwhelming but also energizing in a way my teaching job had stopped being years ago. My siblings made one final attempt to challenge the inheritance through a different legal mechanism, arguing that the company's value had been significantly understated in the will and that they were entitled to a portion based on the actual current valuation of approximately $13.7 million. This challenge failed even faster than the previous ones, because Bernard had documentation showing that the valuation in the will had been conservative on purpose and that any appreciation in value between Uncle Elijah's death and the ownership transfer was irrelevant to inheritance distribution. After that defeat, my siblings stopped fighting legally, but started a different kind of campaign. Sterling went on LinkedIn and posted a carefully worded statement about family disappointments and the importance of meritocracy, never naming me directly but making it clear who he was talking about. Octavia gave an interview to a business magazine about inheritance challenges in the tech industry, using our case as an example of how emotional factors sometimes override qualifications. Magnolia's approach was more personal. She called me 6 weeks after the final legal decision, her voice tired. "I'm not calling to fight or to try to change anything. I just want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm disappointed and hurt, but I understand why Uncle Elijah made the choice he did. We were terrible nieces and nephews. We treated him like an obligation instead of a person." The admission surprised me enough that I didn't know how to respond immediately. Magnolia continued, "I've been going through therapy since this all started, working on why I'm so driven by achievement and status. My therapist pointed out that I've spent my entire adult life trying to impress people who were already dead or who never cared about me in the first place. Uncle Elijah cared, and I ignored him. That's on me, not you." I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I hoped we could eventually rebuild some kind of relationship, though I didn't know what that would look like. Running DataCrypt Solutions turned out to be equal parts terrifying and fulfilling. Dr. Tanaka became my closest advisor, teaching me the technical foundations I needed to understand our products and services. I hired an experienced CEO to handle day-to-day operations, while I focused on strategic direction and maintaining Uncle Elijah's mission. The company had been negotiating a lucrative contract with a government agency that wanted to use our encryption technology for surveillance purposes. The deal would have been worth $8 million annually. I canceled it after reading the fine print and realizing it would have compromised the privacy protections Uncle Elijah had built the company to defend. The board was split on my decision. Half supported maintaining our principles, half thought I was naive and leaving money on the table. I stood firm, and we found alternative clients who wanted encryption for protection rather than control. Within 6 months of taking ownership, I'd established a new division of the company focused on providing free encryption services to journalists, activists, and nonprofit organizations in authoritarian countries. The division wasn't profitable, but it fulfilled Uncle Elijah's vision more directly than anything else we did. Dr. Tanaka helped design systems that were simple enough for non-technical users, but sophisticated enough to resist government hacking attempts. We started getting media attention for our work, profiles in tech magazines about the community college teacher who'd inherited a cybersecurity company and was using it to protect human rights. The attention was uncomfortable but useful for attracting clients and talent who cared about mission over money. Sterling sent me an article about the company with a brief message. "I wouldn't have done what you're doing, but I respect it." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging that maybe Uncle Elijah had made the right choice. A year after Uncle Elijah's death, I organized a memorial event at DataCrypt Solutions headquarters, inviting everyone who'd known him professionally or personally. My siblings all came, standing awkwardly in the lobby that now displayed a portrait of Uncle Elijah alongside the company's founding principles. I gave a speech about his vision and values, about how he'd built a company that prioritized protecting freedom over maximizing profit, about how he'd taught me through bedtime stories that the most valuable things in life can't be possessed, only appreciated. Octavia cried during the speech, real tears that she didn't try to hide. Afterwards, she approached me in private. "I'm sorry for how I treated you during the inheritance process. I was entitled and cruel. You deserved it, and I didn't." I thanked her and meant it, though I knew our relationship would never be what it might have been if we'd chosen different paths decades earlier. The company continued to grow under my unconventional leadership. By year 3, we'd doubled our revenue while maintaining our ethical standards about who we'd work with and how our technology would be used. I'd learned enough about encryption and cybersecurity to hold my own in technical conversations, though I still relied heavily on experts for detailed implementation. What I brought to the company was the ability to articulate why our work mattered beyond profit margins, to inspire employees around a mission of protecting human dignity and freedom in a digital age. Uncle Elijah had been right, that I understood the company's purpose better than my siblings would have. They would have maximized value and sold to the highest bidder. I was building something that mattered more than money, proving that success could be measured in impact rather than just income. 5 years after solving Uncle Elijah's encryption challenge, I sat in the same attorney's office where Bernard had first read the will, this time to establish my own estate plan. I'd never married or had children, instead pouring my energy into running the company and teaching part-time because I'd discovered I missed the classroom. Bernard asked who I wanted to leave the company to when I died. I thought about my siblings, about whether they'd learned the same lessons I had about the difference between wealth and value. I decided to create a similar challenge, requiring any potential heir to demonstrate understanding of the company's mission through actions rather than credentials. Whoever has spent the most time volunteering for organizations that protect privacy, freedom of speech, or human rights over the previous decade, I told Bernard. Whoever can prove through their life choices that they understand what this company exists to defend. He smiled and started drafting the language, both of us knowing I was continuing Uncle Elijah's legacy of rewarding presence and values over achievement and status. The bedtime stories Uncle Elijah had told me as a child became legendary in the company, referenced in training materials and strategic planning meetings as examples of the philosophy that guided our decisions. Employees who'd never met him knew about the dragon who learned to sing and the princess who saved herself, understanding them as parables about choosing compassion over conquest and self-determination over prescribed roles. Dr. Tanaka created a scholarship program in Uncle Elijah's name for students pursuing cybersecurity degrees, with demonstrated commitment to ethical applications of technology. The first recipients included a refugee who'd used encryption to document human rights abuses in her home country, and a journalist who'd protected sources while exposing corruption. Uncle Elijah would have been proud of who we were choosing to support. 10 years after his death, on the anniversary of the day I'd cracked his encryption challenge, I visited his grave with a USB drive containing the complete story of what I'd built with his gift, knowing he'd understand that the real inheritance had never been the money or the company, but the values and vision he'd encrypted in stories and revealed through love. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.